Good morning once again. We're welcome into today's session of presentation. We're still on development of resilient transport infrastructure in Africa. This is module 4.1, financing of development of infrastructure. I have been on with you, so I want to guess you're familiar with me, you're familiar with my name, and you're familiar with my presentation. It's still the same method I've been using in the past modules, and we usually come up with the summary of this presentation. Now my summary is as follows: introduction, financial needs for infrastructure, who finances infrastructure, opportunities for the private sector, possibilities of other sources of financing. Introduction. In sub-Saharan Africa, mainly finances its infrastructure. A total of 59.4 billion US dollars or 72.9% of financing for infrastructure was estimated by the IMF in 2015. But there are also external contributions in funding. Indeed, we can note the increase in as that of China, which is a major bilateral partner for the continent today, and that of other new emerging partners such as India, South Korea, Malaysia, Russia. Financial needs. For every project, there has to be a financial needs, and in that we have to think of how to implement it. Here, I'm presenting these slides to talk about financial needs when it comes to infrastructure development projects. The costing of financial needs to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, or for infrastructure projects in Africa has been the subject of numerous estimates. These can vary quite strongly depending on the objective selected. What optimal level of infrastructure are we aiming for? Is it basic infrastructure for all or improved infrastructure for the majority? The methods used. What assumptions made on the evolution demographic, the evolution of the rate of urbanization, the cost and the lifespan of technologies, and the organizations which have them achieved? Different estimates. The World Bank estimates the necessary needs for transport, energy, ICT, and water infrastructure at $93 billion per year for the African continent. The Africa Transport Sector Outlook 2040 of the African Union estimates the transport infrastructure needs at $68 billion per year. The Africa Energy Outlook 2040 considered that 43.6 billion per year will be needed for energy infrastructure. The Global Infrastructure Outlook initiative led by the G20 experts in infrastructure financing needs of $174 billion per year for the entire continent Africa. The completion of the plan projects of the PIDA Priority Action Plan, PAP, alone was estimated at 68 billion US dollars, or nearly 8 billion per year over a period of 9 years, 2012 to 2020 projection. According to the African Development Bank, AFDB, the infrastructure needs of the African continents are between $130 and $170 billion per year. The Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, ICA, reports for its parts 100.8 billion infrastructure commitment is needed in 2018. Despite an increase of 24% in 1 year and 33% compared to the period of 2015 to 2017, this amount remains below the $130 to $170 billion identified by the African Development Bank, still suggesting a financing gap of 30 to 50 billion per year. Now, in these financing needs for these projects that have been outlined by different organizations which have researched on the needs to make infrastructure development easier and possible in the continent Africa, it takes us to who finances infrastructure. Infrastructure development can be at national government level, which are the primary providers of funding for infrastructure. According to ICA report, commitments from African countries increased by 26% in 2018 compared to the average of the previous 3 years. In absolute terms, African countries constitute the main source of financing with 37% of total commitments or 37.5 billion US dollars. Countries and regions intervene either directly or through funds. The commitments of the European Commission, EC, amounted, for example, in 2016 to the tune of 1.4 billion US dollars via the European Development Fund, EDF, for countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Of the same way, France commitments and disbursements are made through the French Development Agency, AFD, its subsidiary, Proparco, dedicated to the private sector, and the French Global Environmental Facility, FFEM. Bilateral and multilateral institutions such as the African Development Bank and the World Bank, via the International Finance Corporation, IFC, also support investment in infrastructure and particularly projects with public-private participation. Since 2009, the African Development Bank has thus dedicated 60% of its portfolio to infrastructure projects, and over the period 2010 to 2016, it has allocated 6 billion for the electrification of Africa. The African Development Bank has also launched an Energy New Deal to increase access to electricity from the current level of around 25% to almost 100% by the year 2025. The Regional Development Bank also provides considerable support for infrastructure development through the granting of loans. For example, the Development Bank of South Africa, it's committed to the tune of 1.2 billion US dollars in 2016. Alongside the joint 924 million US dollars committed by the Bank West Africa of Development, BOAD, the Bank Investment of Development of ECOWAS, BIDC, Trade and Development Bank, TDB, and the East African Development Bank, EADB, have been very up in raising grants or loans for infrastructure development. Institutional investments is another way for which we can finance infrastructure development. With approximately 634 billion US dollars in assets under management in 2017, African institutional investors represent a significant potential source of funding. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, the asset managed by the latter are expected to almost double by 2020, rising to 1,100 billion US dollars. Institutional investors, which bring together pension funds, insurers, sovereign funds, and deposit banks, are also capable of financing infrastructure development in Africa. Through the nature of their liabilities made up of intergenerational contractual commitments for pension funds and insurance companies, public capital for sovereign funds, or mixed capital for size the pot, these entities' financial resources should have little dependence on the refinancing capacities of short-term markets and have sufficient abundant long-term resources. But in practice, each of these actors faces their own intrinsic challenges and the environment in which they operate. The investment capacities and strategies are therefore highly dependent on the nature of the resources collected, the mechanism enabling them to be mobilized, and the regulatory framework. The deposit boxes, although in quote, the financial capacities are at this stage ill-suited to the financing of large-scale infrastructure projects, the African Fund could assume within defined risk limits a role of precursor and of seed. As the capacities of the government are limited by national, economic, and fiscal constraints, it is essential to have recourse to external financing. So is government intervention complemented by the participation of development finance bodies outside the countries? The latter are from Europe, America, Arab countries, or Asia. China contributes 25%, which is $25.7 billion. Members of the ICA with 20% put at 20.2 billion US dollars. Then the private sector with 12%, which is a total sum of 11.8 billion US dollars. Opportunities in investing in infrastructure development for the private sector. Until this day, the bulk of infrastructure funding, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, has been mostly supported by the countries of the region, contrary to what general opinion thinks. The total commitment for the construction of infrastructure are estimated at 4.3 trillion US dollars. And according to data accumulated by Global Infrastructure Hub, GIH, however, over the same period, the needs amount to about 6 trillion US dollars. In the current conditions of the region economies, marked by volatility in their main exports market and growth that has slowed down somewhat short of breath, the GIH believes that African states will not be able to find all of this funding, even with the support of institutional donors such as the World Bank Group, International Public Aid, or even China. The additional financing needs to be completed amount to nearly 1,700 billion US dollars. According to several recent analyses, this financial challenge for infrastructure in Africa constitutes a great opportunity for the international private sector. Governments of African states have no choice. Their resources are less and less important, facing the needs of their population. In addition, there is the requirement for their economies to benefit from investments, no longer to increase the stock of infrastructure, but to build works likely to have a positive impact on growth. Public-private partnership, PPP, are no longer a new concept, and motivated government can make PPPs a part of sustainable and viable regional infrastructure development successes. According to ICA, the absence enabling legislation and regulations, the lack of local skills, and a poor understanding of risk allocation in PPPs are all bottlenecks that currently prevent Africa from fully unlocking the interests of the private sector. Many of them have developed legislative frameworks to improve contracts with the private sector, but their implementation is a different story. Other sources of funding. The realization that additional and more secure financing is essential to achieve globally agreed development goals has led to the search for innovative sources of financing to complement traditional sources of finance. These innovative sources of finance are needed to tackle global challenges. Other funding sources. There is no single definition of what an innovative development finance mechanism is. Recently, a number of initiatives have been launched, particularly in the area of health, but they have not made it possible to mobilize very significant resources. The feasibility. New funding mechanisms depend not only on the existence of funding sources, but also on how the sources mobilized are channeled to users. The creation of international reserve assets could boost financing for development and global public goods, producing around $100 billion a year in international cooperation. An internationally agreed carbon tax could generate $250 billion US per Yeah. And a small tax of foreign exchange could add about 40 billion US dollars. Pension funds. In a report published in March 2017, the African Growth Brookings Institution Initiative raises awareness of the unexplored potential of pension funds as a source of finance for African infrastructure. In Africa, pension funds are relatively large. These were estimated on average at 380 billion US dollars in absolute capital for 10 countries of the continent: South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Kenya, Nigeria, Mauritius, Lesotho, etc. in 2013. However, this capital lacks appropriate frameworks guaranteeing its use in infrastructure development. On the other hand, there are obstacles to the use of pension funds in the financing of infrastructure. One of its barriers is the availability of capital in the pension system for investment in infrastructure, with restrictions related to governance, regulations, and supervisions of these funds. In addition, should this restriction be lifted, pension funds should take into account the risks associated with infrastructure projects and demand a clear, transparent, fair, and predictable policy framework for investment of capitals in infrastructure. Other sources of funding could also be that in order for these pension funds to participate in the financing of infrastructure, it should tackle the factors who influence their will in order to unleash their potential by matter. It remains clear that sources of funding other than the circuit known in the level bilateral and multilateral exist, but the community international and opted for PPP. Thank you for your attention. And I'm pretty sure that with this narrative, we are understanding the module as we present all of the objectives and aims. Thank you once again for your listening.